You've just decided to build your first bamboo fly rod. Great. What comes next? Well, the first thing you should do is figure out which rod you want to build. Specifically, I'm referring to the taper here, because the taper is going to establish the length of rod and the line weight of the rod that you make. This is important because those decisions in turn influence many things, from the comb of bamboo that you're going to select all the way to the tip top that you'll put on at the end. So it's an important decision. So how do you make it? Well, you might already know the kind of thing that you want. And if you're fishing around a little bit, pun intended, look to the fishing you do. So for example, if you're casting tiny, tiny blue wing olives to rising trout, you might want a specific rod, especially if it's in something like a small stream. However, if you're tossing larger bass bugs in a pond, that might be a very different rod. So look to yourself and the fishing you know you do. In many ways, this is very much like going to a fly rod shop and purchasing one off the shelf. You're going to think about those same things. However, because this is you making the rod and the field is really wide open, it can be a much more daunting task than that. So what are some other things you can do? I've mentioned on this channel before that I'm a librarian, so a lot of times I turn to books and I want to see what authors have to say, and specifically, in this case, rod makers. What do other rod makers have to say on the subject? As it turns out, some of the literature has a little bit. Some is frustratingly vague, and some is just not that great. So starting with the not that great, at least in this day and age, there's a book, it's an older book called The Bamboo Rod and How to Build It by Claude Creeder. And there's some bizarre advice in here that talks about building a rod that maybe you already have, or at least have cast. If you've cast one and like it and don't own it, that might be useful. But he goes on to talk about like bait casting rods as your first rod. That's probably not where your head's at if you're watching this right now. However, there is some really good advice in Maurer's book, Fundamentals of Building a Bamboo Fly Rod. Some of the other more popular modern books don't get too deep into this topic, other than to say, here's some tapers in our book, all of these would be good for beginning fly rod makers. Okay, that's great, but it's not really helpful in deciding which rod to make. So let's look at what Maurer has to say, and I'll add a little bit to that, my thoughts. Specifically, I'm not going to read this all to you, but specifically, he does recommend two-piece rods. He recommends rods 7 or 7.5 feet as fly rods, and only for 4 or 5 weight lines as beginner rods. He goes on to talk about some exceptions if you're only building one rod and that type of thing. But I again would point to what type of fishing do you like to do, because you want a rod that's going to inspire you. This process for me is very inspiring. Thinking about the rod, the whole time I'm building it, I'm thinking about what it will cast like, the fish it's going to catch. All of those things are going through my mind while I'm planning out the rod, while I'm varnishing the rod, the whole time I'm building the rod. So it's inspiring to me to really think about the rod I'm going to make. I would probably expand on his advice. I think his advice is very good, but I think beginners would also be fine to go a little bit outside that range. Specifically, maybe a little higher in that range. So he says 7 to 7.5 feet. I would push that out to about 8 feet. That gives you a little more flexibility. I also would probably push that to at least a 6 weight rod, maybe even 7. And that really, that 4 to 7 weight gives you a lot of different rods that are good in many situations. And really you can fulfill a lot of the things that you're probably interested in if you're watching this channel. So this inspirational process, pick something you want, pick it in a manageable range, and that really is his effort here, is to give the beginner something that is manageable. Two-piece rods are easier. If you have your heart set on a 3-piece rod, you can do it. And it's only a little bit harder, a few more steps, that kind of thing. But do what you want to do, but recognize it's going to be easier in that kind of middle ground. If you go really high, say 8-9 weight, if you go really low, 1-2 weight, that's really going to start to be difficult for various reasons. So stick in that range. The other thing to do, now you have an established range, is you have to decide which taper, and there are so many. That's a difficult question. If you read some of these books, and you can get them interlibrary loaned from your library if your library doesn't have them, and that way you can get access to books that may not even be on the market anymore. Get some of these books in. There's tapers in these books. Specifically, I'm talking about Marr's book, Catnaw's book, Garrison's book, and Jack Howell's book. All of those books have excellent taper designs in them. So get the book, think about the fishing you want to do, look through the tapers there, read about those tapers a little bit, and finally, of course, you can go online and ask people. There's Facebook groups. There's the Classic Fly Rod Forum, and you're going to be inundated by opinions there. I wanted to avoid giving specific taper advice because your fishing is your own. However, if you want advice on a taper that you might use for a specific type of fishing that you are going to do, leave it in the comments below and I'll be happy to respond with my opinion. There are a lot of opinions in this hobby. While you're doing that, click like if this has been a helpful video. Please subscribe to the channel, that helps me out. When you do, hit that bell notification and you'll be notified when I upload new videos. So I will see you around the next bend, and until then, tight glue lines.